Henry Sanders sat alone in his spacious living room, staring at the glass of whiskey in his hand. The place was silent, but not in a peaceful way. It was the kind of silence that reminded him how empty his life had become. He had everything: a mansion on the hills, a successful industry, and enough money to buy whatever he wanted. But none of that mattered. He was alone. He swirled the whiskey, eyes lost in the golden liquid. The memories of his son were always there, lurking just beneath the surface. It had been years since the accident, but the pain was just as raw. There was no family left now. No one to carry his name. No one to care if he lived or died. The lawyer's visit that morning had been different from the usual. The man, James Dars, was sharp-eyed and always had some scheme ready to present. But today's suggestion was unsettling, even for James. "You need an heir, Henry," James said, leaning forward, eyes locked on Henry's face. "Think about your legacy. All this wealth, everything you built, it'll be for nothing if you die without someone to pass it on to." Henry frowned, setting his glass down. "I've heard this before, James. You think I don't know?" His voice was cold, like his eyes. "Then do something about it," James insisted. "If you can't have a family naturally, you can acquire one." "Acquire?" Henry's brow creased. "Yes, think of it as an arrangement. There are families out there in desperate need. You could change someone's life, and, in return, they become your heir." James smiled as if it was a simple business deal. Henry scoffed, shaking his head. "You're talking about buying a child, James. That's—" He trailed off, words caught in his throat. "That's practical," James finished for him. "You're not getting younger, Henry, and you know what happens to estates like yours when there's no will. It's torn apart. All the people you've worked so hard to keep out will come crawling in." Henry picked up the glass again, taking a long sip. He knew James was right. There was no one left, and the thought of everything he'd built being destroyed by distant relatives or greedy lawyers made him sick. Later that evening, after a few more glasses, Henry found himself talking to James again. His voice was quieter, less steady. He spoke of his son, how the accident had taken everything from him, how he had sworn never to care for anyone again. James listened, nodding at all the right times, offering just enough sympathy to keep Henry talking. "Maybe you're right," Henry finally mumbled. Maybe it's time I do something about it." The next day, Henry sat in his study, staring at a piece of paper with a name scribbled on it. The name of a family that James had found. A family in dire straits, living in poverty, struggling to feed their children. He hesitated for a long time, the phone in his hand, before he finally made the call. The meeting was arranged quickly. The family, desperate for the money, agreed to meet Henry that same evening. When Henry arrived at the small, run-down house, he felt a sense of unease. The place was crumbling, the paint peeling off the walls, the windows grimy. A woman opened the door, her eyes hollow, her face gaunt. Behind her, a man sat on a battered couch, staring at the floor, while a young boy, Samuel, stood beside him, looking at Henry with wide, curious eyes. Henry stepped inside, the silence pressing in on him. He could see the despair in the mother's eyes, the resignation in the father's posture. They didn't want to do this, but they had no choice. Henry swallowed hard, feeling a pang of something, guilt, maybe, but he pushed it aside. He wasn't here to feel. He was here to solve a problem. He handed over an envelope filled with cash, the amount that James had said would be sufficient. The mother's hands trembled as she took it, her eyes not meeting Henry. The father nodded, barely looking at the boy. Samuel, on the other hand, just stared at Henry. He didn't cry, didn't make a sound. He just looked, as if trying to understand what was happening. Henry met his gaze for a moment, then looked away. He turned to leave, Samuel following him out the door without a word from either parent. It was done. The drive back to the mansion was silent. Samuel sat in the back seat, looking out the window. Henry glanced at him in the rearview mirror, wondering what was going through the boy's head. But he didn't ask. He didn't know how to talk to him, and he wasn't sure he wanted to. This wasn't supposed to be about feelings. It was about practicality. When they arrived at the mansion, Henry led Samuel inside, the vastness of the place echoing with their footsteps. The boy looked around, his eyes wide at the sight of the grand staircase, the chandeliers, the sheer size of everything. Henry watched him for a moment, then turned away. "This is your room," he said, opening a door to a guest bedroom. It was larger than the entire house Samuel had lived in, but the boy said nothing. He just walked inside, looking around quietly. "Get some sleep," Henry said, his voice gruff. "We'll figure things out tomorrow." He closed the door, leaning against it for a moment. He felt an overwhelming sense of emptiness. He thought this would make him feel something, anything, but all he felt was the same void that had been there before. He walked to his own room, poured himself another drink, and sat down heavily in a chair. The mansion was silent, but it wasn't peaceful. It was the silence of a life that had lost all meaning. Henry closed his eyes, feeling the weight of his decisions settling in. He had thought this would be easy, that it would solve his problem. But as he sat there, he realized it was just the beginning of something far more complicated than he had anticipated. Henry woke up with a throbbing headache. He blinked against the morning light streaming in through the large windows of his bedroom. The events of the previous day came back to him in flashes. The meeting with that poor family, the hollow look in the mother's eyes, the boy, Samuel, standing silently by his side. Henry sighed heavily and got out of bed. He wasn't used to having anyone else in the house besides the cleaning staff, who arrived and left quietly, barely making their presence known. The idea of having a child in his home, one that he had essentially bought, felt unreal, like a bad dream. He made his way to the kitchen, where he found Samuel already sitting at the table. The boy looked up, eyes wide and wary, as Henry entered. Henry cleared his throat. "Morning," Henry muttered, feeling awkward. He opened the refrigerator, scanning the contents. "You hungry?" Samuel nodded, but he didn't say anything. Henry took out some bread and eggs. He wasn't much of a cook, but he managed to scramble some eggs and toast a few slices of bread. He placed a plate in front of Samuel and sat across from him. They ate in silence. Samuel kept his eyes on his plate, his small hands moving carefully as he ate. Henry watched him, trying to figure out what to say, but nothing came to mind. The boy looked fragile, his eyes holding a kind of emptiness that made Henry's chest tighten uncomfortably. After breakfast, Henry led Samuel through the house, showing him the different rooms, the way to the garden, the library. Samuel followed quietly, his steps barely making a sound on the polished floors. The mansion, normally a place of solitude, felt strange now, with this small presence moving through its grand halls. "Do you like to read?" Henry asked, more out of a need to fill the silence than actual curiosity. Samuel shrugged. "I guess." Henry frowned. He wasn't used to kids, didn't know how to interact with them. He led Samuel to the library and gestured to the shelves filled with books. "Take whatever you want," he said. "You can come here whenever." Samuel nodded, his eyes scanning the shelves, but he didn't move to pick anything. Henry watched him for a moment longer, then turned away. The rest of the day passed slowly. Henry tried to work, but his thoughts kept drifting back to Samuel. The boy stayed in his room mostly, coming out only when Henry called him for meals. The mansion felt even quieter than usual, the tension between them making every sound seem amplified. By late afternoon, Henry felt exhausted. The weight of everything, his decision to take Samuel in, the pressure from James, the emptiness of his life, it all pressed down on him. He could feel a headache forming, a dull throb behind his eyes. He tried to ignore it, but as the evening wore on, it got worse. He was sitting in the living room, a glass of whiskey in his hand, when the room began to spin. He blinked, trying to steady himself, but his vision blurred. He felt his heart pounding, his breath coming in short gasps. The glass slipped from his fingers, shattering on the floor. "Henry?" Samuel's voice was faint, distant. Henry tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. He felt himself slipping, the room tilting, and then everything went black. Henry woke to the sound of beeping. It was faint, rhythmic, and there was a bright light above him. He blinked, his vision clearing slowly. He was in a hospital room. The ceiling was white, the light harsh, and there was a weight on his chest that made it hard to breathe. He turned his head slightly, wincing at the pain that shot through his skull. Samuel was sitting in a chair by the window, his small frame curled up, eyes red from crying. The boy looked up when Henry moved, his eyes widening. "Henry?" Samuel got up, moving to the side of the bed. Are you okay?" Henry swallowed, his throat dry. "I'm fine," he managed to say, his voice barely a whisper. He closed his eyes, feeling the exhaustion in every bone. He hadn't expected this, hadn't expected to be here, in a hospital bed, with a boy he barely knew standing beside him. "How long?" Henry tried to ask, but his voice trailed off. 2 days, Samuel said quietly. "You've been here for 2 days." Henry let out a slow breath. 2 days. It felt like an eternity. He looked at Samuel, the boy's face pale, his eyes wide and filled with worry. It was a look that Henry hadn't seen in a long time, someone genuinely worried about him. "I'm sorry," Henry muttered, not sure why he was apologizing. Maybe it was for collapsing like this, for scaring the boy. Maybe it was for everything that had led to this moment. Samuel shook his head. "It's okay," he said. I didn't know what to do. The people who work for you, they called an ambulance." Henry nodded slightly, closing his eyes again. He felt a heaviness in his chest, a sense of failure. He had taken this boy in, thinking it would be easy, thinking it would solve his problems, but it was turning out to be more than he could handle. "Are you going to be okay?" Samuel's voice was small, hesitant. Henry opened his eyes, looking at the boy. He didn't know how to answer that. He wasn't sure if he was going to be okay. He had spent so long running from his pain, from his past, and now it had caught up to him, crashing over him like a wave. "I don't know," Henry said honestly. He reached out, his hand shaking, and Samuel took it, his small fingers wrapping around Henry. It was a simple gesture, but it meant something. It meant that, for now, they were in this together. The nurse came in then, checking the monitors, making notes on her clipboard. She gave Henry a small smile. "You're awake. That's a good sign." Henry nodded, feeling too tired to say anything. The nurse glanced at Samuel, her expression softening. "You should get some rest too, sweetheart," she said. "It's been a long couple of days." Samuel nodded, but he didn't let go of Henry's hand. Henry closed his eyes, feeling the boy's presence beside him. It was strange, having someone care about him like this. It was something he hadn't realized he needed until now. The nurse left, and the room was quiet again. Henry took a deep breath, feeling the tension slowly leave his body. He wasn't sure what was going to happen next, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he wasn't completely alone. "Get some sleep, kid," Henry muttered, his voice barely audible. "We'll figure things out tomorrow." Samuel nodded, his eyes closing as he leaned back in the chair, still holding Henry's hand. The room was quiet, but it wasn't the kind of silence that Henry was used to. It was different. It was almost comforting. Henry was discharged from the hospital 2 days later. The doctor advised rest, but Henry knew rest was a luxury he couldn't afford. There was too much at stake. He was barely out of the hospital when he made the decision. He had to take Samuel back to his family. He couldn't be responsible for the boy. He wasn't fit to be anyone's guardian, especially not a child who needed so much. He called James on the way home. "Get in touch with the boy's family," Henry said, his voice flat. "Tell them I want to return him." James hesitated on the other end of the line. "Henry, are you sure about this?" "Yes, I'm sure," Henry snapped. "Just do it." Henry hung up and glanced at Samuel, who was sitting quietly beside him in the back seat of the car. The boy was looking out the window, his expression blank. Henry felt a pang of guilt, but he pushed it aside. It was for the best. Samuel needed to be with people who could care for him properly. When they arrived at the mansion, Samuel went straight to his room without a word. Henry watched him go, a heavy feeling settling in his chest. He turned away, heading to his study. He poured himself a drink, the familiar burn of the whiskey calming his nerves. The phone rang an hour later. It was James. "They don't want him back," James said. His voice was quiet, almost as if he felt sorry for Henry. "What?" Henry frowned, setting his glass down. "The family," James repeated. "They don't want him back. They said they can't afford to take care of him. They don't want the responsibility." Henry felt a wave of frustration. "They can't just refuse. He's their son. Legally, he's yours now," James said. "You paid them, Henry. They signed the papers. It's done." Henry hung up without another word. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. The weight of his decision was pressing down on him, and for the first time, he realized just how deep he had gotten himself. He didn't have a choice. Samuel was his responsibility now, whether he wanted it or not. He got up, his legs feeling heavy, and made his way to Samuel's room. He knocked on the door, waiting for a moment before opening it. Samuel was sitting on the bed, staring at the floor. He looked up when Henry entered, his eyes wide and uncertain. "Your family," Henry started, then paused. He didn't know how to say it. They're not taking you back." Samuel's face didn't change. He just nodded, his gaze dropping back to the floor. Henry felt a lump in his throat, a mixture of anger and guilt. "I know this isn't what you wanted," Henry said, his voice rough, "but we'll figure it out. I'll take care of you." Samuel nodded again, but he didn't say anything. Henry watched him for a moment, then turned and left the room, closing the door behind him. He stood in the hallway, his hands trembling slightly. He had thought he could fix this, thought he could make it right by sending Samuel back. But now, it was clear that there was no easy solution. The next few days were a blur of tension. Henry tried to establish some sort of routine for Samuel, but it was clear that neither of them knew how to act around the other. Samuel stayed quiet, keeping to himself, and Henry found himself avoiding the boy whenever he could. The silence in the house was heavy, almost unbearable. Henry's phone rang again one afternoon. It was James, and his tone was different this time. Urgent. "Henry, we need to talk," James said. "There's a problem." Henry frowned. "What kind of problem?" "It's about your assets," James said. "There's been some movement, and I think you need to see this in person." Henry's heart sank. He knew what this was about. He had been putting off dealing with the financial side of things, but now it seemed he couldn't avoid it any longer. He agreed to meet James at his office later that day. When Henry arrived at James's office, the lawyer was waiting for him with a stack of papers spread out on his desk. "What's going on?" Henry asked, his voice tense. James gestured to the papers. "Your assets. Some of them have been used as collateral for new investments." "I didn't authorize these transactions, Henry. Someone's been moving your money." Henry felt his stomach drop. "What do you mean, someone? Who else could access my accounts?" James hesitated. "It could be any number of people. You have a lot of holdings, a lot of people involved. But it looks like someone is trying to take control of your assets. If we don't act quickly, you could lose everything." Henry felt a rush of panic. He had spent his entire life building his empire, and now it was slipping through his fingers. He couldn't let that happen. Not now, not when everything was already falling apart. "What do I need to do?" Henry asked, his voice barely above a whisper. James looked at him, his expression serious. "You need to take back control, sign these documents, and we can start the process of reversing the transactions. But it's going to be a fight, Henry. Whoever's behind this isn't going to back down easily." Henry nodded, his hands trembling as he took the pen from James. He signed the papers, feeling a sense of dread settle in his chest. This was just the beginning. He knew that much. When Henry got back home, Samuel was sitting in the living room, flipping through a book. He looked up as Henry entered, his eyes wide with curiosity. Henry paused, watching the boy for a moment. "Everything okay?" Samuel asked quietly. Henry forced a smile. "Yeah," he said, though his voice betrayed him. "Just some work stuff." Samuel nodded, but he didn't press further. Henry sat down on the couch, letting out a long breath. He could feel the weight of everything pressing down on him. The pressure from James, the threat to his assets, the responsibility of caring for Samuel. It was all too much. He looked over at Samuel, the boy's small frame dwarfed by the oversized chair he was sitting in. There was something about the way Samuel looked at him, something that made Henry's chest tighten. The boy trusted him, even though Henry knew he didn't deserve it. "Samuel," Henry said, his voice rough, I'm going to make this work. For both of us." Samuel looked at him, his eyes wide and hopeful. He nodded slowly, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Henry didn't know if he could keep that promise. He didn't know if he was capable of being the kind of person Samuel needed, but as he looked at the boy, he knew he had to try. For Samuel's sake, and maybe for his own. Henry woke up early the next morning, feeling the familiar weight of exhaustion. He had barely slept. The pressure of everything, his assets being compromised, the boy he was now responsible for, kept his mind from finding any rest. He got out of bed, taking a deep breath, and decided it was time to try and establish some sort of routine. He went to Samuel's room and knocked gently. "Samuel, you awake?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. There was a moment of silence before the door opened, and Samuel appeared, still in his pajamas, rubbing his eyes. He looked up at Henry, blinking in the morning light. "Morning," Henry said awkwardly. "I thought we could have breakfast together. Maybe start, I don't know, a routine or something." Samuel nodded, his face expressionless. He followed Henry downstairs to the kitchen, and they prepared breakfast in silence. Henry scrambled some eggs while Samuel toasted the bread, their movements slow and uncoordinated. They sat down at the table, eating without much conversation, the quietness between them growing heavy. After breakfast, Henry decided to show Samuel around the grounds of the mansion. He led the boy outside to the garden, where the morning sun cast a soft light over the manicured lawns and the trimmed hedges. Henry pointed to different sections of the garden, explaining their purpose, but Samuel just nodded, his eyes downcast. "Do you like the garden?" Henry asked, trying to break the silence. Samuel shrugged. "It's big," he said, his voice barely audible. Henry sighed. He didn't know how to reach Samuel. Every attempt felt forced, like he was trying too hard or not hard enough. He wasn't used to this. He had never been good at connecting with people, not since his son. And now, he found himself faced with this boy who needed him, and he had no idea how to bridge the gap between them. Later that day, Henry tried to engage Samuel in small talk while they were in the living room. He asked Samuel about his favorite foods, his favorite games, anything that could get the boy to open up a little. But Samuel's answers were short, his gaze distant, as if he was somewhere else entirely. Henry clenched his jaw, frustration building inside him. He wanted to help Samuel, but he didn't know how, and the more he tried, the more he felt like he was failing. He was reminded, again and again, of the accident, of his own son, and how he had failed him too. The guilt, the pain, it was all coming back, and it was almost too much to bear. They tried to have dinner together that evening, but it was a disaster. Henry attempted to make a simple meal, pasta, nothing fancy, but he burned the sauce, and Samuel ended up eating plain noodles in silence. Henry watched the boy, feeling the weight of his own incompetence, the knowledge that he couldn't even manage to make a decent meal for him. "I'm sorry," Henry said, his voice strained. I'm not good at this." Samuel looked up, his expression unreadable. He didn't say anything, just gave a small nod, and continued eating. That night, after cleaning up the mess in the kitchen, Henry sat down heavily in his armchair in the living room. He stared at the darkened windows, the silence of the house pressing down on him. He thought about Samuel, about the way the boy kept everything bottled up inside. He knew Samuel had lost someone, his brother. James had mentioned it in passing, and Henry could see the grief in Samuel's eyes, the emptiness that matched his own. Henry closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. He wanted to do better, but he didn't know how. He had spent so many years shutting himself off from people, from emotions, that now it felt impossible to break through the walls he had built around himself. And yet, here was this boy, needing him to be something more, something he wasn't sure he could be. The next day, Henry found Samuel sitting by the window in the library, staring out at the garden. He approached slowly, not wanting to startle the boy. Samuel looked up when Henry got closer, his eyes wide. "Hey," Henry said softly. "Mind if I join you?" Samuel shrugged, and Henry took a seat across from him. They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the faint rustling of leaves outside. After a while, Samuel spoke, his voice so quiet that Henry almost didn't hear him. "My brother, he died because we didn't have enough money to get him to a doctor." Henry's heart clenched. He hadn't expected Samuel to open up like this, hadn't expected the boy to share something so painful. He didn't know what to say. I'm sorry, Samuel," Henry said, his voice thick. "I didn't know." Samuel nodded, his eyes still on the garden. "We didn't have anything. If we had money, maybe he would still be here." Henry swallowed hard, the guilt settling in his chest like a heavy stone. He thought of all the wealth he had, how he could have helped someone like Samuel's family, could have saved his brother, if only he had known. The realization made him feel sick. I wish I could change things," Henry said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I wish I could make it better for you." Samuel looked at him then, his eyes filled with a mix of emotion, anger, sadness, maybe even a little hope. Henry didn't know how to read it, but he knew that whatever it was real, and that was something. For the first time, Henry felt like there was a chance, maybe just a small one, that he could make a difference, that he could be there for Samuel, even if he wasn't perfect, even if he had no idea what he was doing. He reached out, resting his hand gently on Samuel's arm. "We'll figure this out," Henry said, his voice firmer now. "Together." Samuel looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. There was still a distance between them, still walls that needed breaking down, but for the first time, Henry felt like they had made some kind of connection. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The rest of the day passed quietly, but it was a different kind of quiet. The tension between them had lessened, just a little. They shared dinner again, and while the conversation was still minimal, there was something new in the air, an understanding, a willingness to try. After dinner, Henry watched as Samuel went up to his room, the boy turning back at the top of the stairs to give Henry a small wave before disappearing into his room. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything to Henry. He smiled, a real smile, For the first time in what felt like years, he knew they still had a long way to go. He knew he would make mistakes, that there would be more awkward silences, more failed attempts to connect. But for the first time, Henry felt like maybe, just maybe, he could be the person Samuel needed him to be. Henry's morning started early, with a sense of urgency gnawing at the back of his mind. He had been struggling to keep things in order ever since the hospitalization, and now, the financial situation was slipping out of his control. He knew he had to face James, knew he had to figure out who was trying to take his assets, but the prospect of it made his stomach churn. He felt tired, physically and mentally, but there was no time to rest. He got dressed, his movements mechanical, and went downstairs. Samuel was already in the kitchen, eating cereal. He looked up as Henry entered, his eyes filled with quiet concern. "Morning," Samuel said, his voice barely above a whisper. Henry forced a smile. "Morning. I've got a meeting with James today. It might take a while, but I'll be back later. All right?" Samuel nodded, his eyes dropping back to his bowl. Henry could see the worry in the boy's expression, the uncertainty. He wished he could offer more reassurance, but he didn't have the words. He gave Samuel a nod and turned to leave. The drive to James's office was tense. Henry's mind raced with thoughts of what might happen, what James might say. He had spent years building his empire, making sure everything was in place, and now it felt like it was all unraveling. When he arrived, James was waiting in his office, a stack of papers spread across his desk. He gestured for Henry to sit down, his expression serious. "Henry," James started, his tone grave. "We need to talk." Henry sat down, his jaw clenched. "What's going on, James?" James took a deep breath. "It's about your assets. Whoever's trying to take control, they're not backing down. They've been moving more money, making it look like it's all above board. They're covering their tracks well, but I've managed to trace some of it." Henry's stomach twisted. "Who's behind this?" James hesitated, his eyes locking on Henry's. "It's more complicated than I thought. I've found evidence that suggests multiple people are involved. People from within your company." Henry's heart sank. "From within?" James nodded. "I'm afraid so. And there's something else, Henry. Whoever it is, they've hired a legal team. They're planning to go after your assets in court. If you don't act now, you could lose everything." Henry's hands tightened into fists. "What do I need to do?" James reached for a document on his desk, sliding it toward Henry. "Sign this. It's a temporary restraining order against anyone accessing your accounts. It'll buy us some time to figure out who's behind this and stop them. But you need to be prepared, Henry. This could turn into a legal battle." Henry took the pen, his hand trembling slightly as he signed the document. He felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him, the fear of losing everything. It wasn't just about the money, it was about control, about his entire life's work. And now, it was slipping away. James watched him, his eyes filled with concern. "We'll get through this, Henry. You just need to stay strong." Henry nodded, but he didn't feel strong. He felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, the ground crumbling beneath his feet. When he got back to the mansion, Samuel was waiting in the living room, his eyes wide with worry. Henry walked in, his shoulders slumped, and sank down onto the couch. "Are you okay?" Samuel asked, his voice small. Henry forced a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm fine, kid. Just work stuff." Samuel moved closer, his eyes searching Henry's face. "Is it bad?" Henry hesitated. He didn't want to burden Samuel with this, didn't want the boy to worry more than he already did, but he also knew he couldn't lie to him. "Yeah," Henry said finally, his voice rough. "It's bad. There are people trying to take what I've built, and I have to fight to keep it." Samuel's eyes widened, and he looked down, his small hands fidgeting in his lap. Are we gonna lose everything?" Henry swallowed hard, reaching out to rest a hand on Samuel's shoulder. "I don't know, but I'm not gonna give up, all right? I'm gonna fight this." Samuel looked up at him, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hope. What if they win?" Henry took a deep breath, his hand tightening slightly on Samuel's shoulder. "If they win, we'll still have each other. That's what matters." Samuel nodded, but his expression remained uncertain. Henry could see the fear in the boy's eyes, and it broke his heart. He wanted to protect Samuel, wanted to make sure the boy was safe, but he knew there were limits to what he could do. That evening, Henry was in his study, going over the documents James had given him. He was tired, his eyes aching from reading, but he couldn't stop. He needed to understand what was happening, needed to find a way to fight back. The door creaked open, and Samuel poked his head in. "Henry?" Samuel's voice was soft. "Can I come in?" Henry looked up, his eyes meeting Samuel. He nodded, gesturing for the boy to come closer. Samuel walked in, his small frame dwarfed by the large room. I wanted to help," Samuel said, holding up a piece of paper. It was a drawing, a simple sketch of Henry, standing tall, with Samuel beside him. In the background there was a house, smaller than the mansion, but with flowers and trees around it. Henry stared at the drawing, his throat tightening. He reached out, taking the paper from Samuel's hands, his fingers brushing against the boy's. "It's not much," Samuel said, his voice shaky. "But I wanted you to have it, so you remember why you're fighting." Henry looked at the drawing, his heart swelling with emotion. He felt a lump in his throat, a wave of something. Gratitude, maybe? Or hope. He looked at Samuel, the boy's eyes wide and vulnerable, and he knew that this was why he was fighting. Not for the money, not for the power, but for this boy who needed him. "Thank you, Samuel," Henry said, his voice rough. This means a lot." Samuel gave him a small smile, and for the first time, Henry felt a real connection between them. He reached out, pulling Samuel into a gentle hug. The boy stiffened for a moment, then relaxed, his small arms wrapping around Henry. They stayed like that for a moment, the silence of the room filled with something warm, something that made Henry feel like maybe, just maybe, they could get through this. He knew the battle ahead would be hard, knew there would be losses, but for the first time, he felt like he wasn't alone. Henry pulled back, looking at Samuel. "I promise you, I'm going to fight with everything I've got, and we'll make it through this. Together." Samuel nodded, his eyes bright. "Together." Henry smiled, feeling a sense of determination settle inside him. He had spent so long running from his fears, hiding from his past, but now, with Samuel by his side, he was ready to fight. He had something to fight for, someone who needed him, someone who believed in him, and that was enough. Henry woke up the next morning with a clear purpose. He was going to fight. He couldn't let everything slip away without giving it his all. Samuel had given him the push he needed, and now, it was time to act. He went to the kitchen, where Samuel was already sitting at the table, eating cereal. The boy looked up, a small smile touching his lips. "Morning, Henry," Samuel said, his voice more confident than usual. "Morning, kid," Henry replied, ruffling Samuel's hair as he walked past. "I've got some work to do today, but I'll be here if you need anything." Samuel nodded, and Henry could see the determination in the boy's eyes. It was almost as if Samuel knew how important this day was. Henry went to his study and began making calls. He needed allies, people he could trust to help him fight back against whoever was trying to take his company. He called old friends, people he hadn't spoken to in years, people who owed him favors. Some of them were willing to help, others hesitated. It was hard, hearing the reluctance in their voices. It was a reminder of how alone he had become over the years, how many bridges he had burned. Still, there were a few who agreed to help, who promised to stand by him. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He spent the day gathering information, reaching out to contacts, trying to put together a plan. The hours passed quickly, and before he knew it, the sun was setting. Samuel came into the study, carrying a tray with sandwiches and a glass of water. He set it down on the desk, his eyes watching Henry carefully. "Thought you might be hungry," Samuel said, his voice quiet. Henry looked up, surprised. He hadn't even realized how hungry he was until he saw the food. He gave Samuel a grateful smile. "Thanks, kid. I appreciate it." Samuel nodded, but he didn't leave. He stood there, his hands fidgeting, his eyes filled with something. Worry, maybe? Or fear? "Everything okay?" Henry asked, taking a bite of the sandwich. Samuel hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, I want to help. I don't want to just sit around and do nothing." Henry put down the sandwich, looking at Samuel. He could see the determination in the boy's eyes, the need to be part of something, to make a difference. It was a look Henry knew well. It was the same look he had seen in his own reflection so many times. "You're already helping," Henry said, his voice gentle. "Just being here, it helps more than you know." Samuel shook his head. "But I want to do more. I want to help you fight." Henry sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's not going to be easy, Samuel. It's dangerous. There are people out there who will do anything to take what they want. I don't want you getting caught up in that." Samuel's eyes hardened. "I don't care. I want to help. "You're all I have now, Henry, and I'm not going to let anyone take that away." Henry felt a lump in his throat, a mixture of pride and fear. He reached out, resting a hand on Samuel's shoulder. "All right, but you have to promise me something. If things get bad, if it looks like we're going to lose, you walk away. You don't put yourself in danger. Promise me that." Samuel hesitated, then nodded. "I promise." Henry pulled the boy into a quick hug, his heart swelling with emotion. He hadn't realized how much Samuel had come to mean to him until this moment. The boy was more than just his responsibility. He was his family now. That night, they stayed up late, going over documents, making plans. Henry showed Samuel how to organize the paperwork, how to look for discrepancies in the accounts. Samuel listened intently, his small hands working diligently as he sorted through the papers. It was a long night, and by the time they were finished, they were both exhausted. But there was a sense of accomplishment, a feeling that they were finally taking control. Henry looked at Samuel, the boy's eyes drooping with sleep, and felt a surge of pride. They were in this together, and that made all the difference. The next day, Henry decided it was time to confront the people who were trying to take his company. He needed to show them that he wasn't going to back down, that he was ready to fight. He called James, setting up a meeting with the board of directors. It was risky, but it was the only way to get ahead of whatever was happening. Samuel insisted on coming with him. Henry tried to argue, tried to convince the boy to stay home, but Samuel wouldn't hear it. He was determined to stand by Henry's side, no matter what. When they arrived at the office, the tension was palpable. Henry could feel the eyes of the employees on him as he walked through the building, Samuel by his side. They knew something was happening, knew that the company was in trouble. Henry kept his head high, his expression unreadable. He couldn't afford to show any weakness. The meeting room was filled with the board members, their faces a mix of curiosity and concern. James was already there, standing at the head of the table. He gave Henry a small nod as they entered. "Thank you all for coming," Henry said, his voice steady. He looked around the room, his eyes meeting each of the board members. "I know there have been rumors, and I wanted to address them directly. There are people trying to take control of this company. People who think they can take what doesn't belong to them. I'm here to tell you that I won't let that happen." There was a murmur around the table, the board members exchanging glances. Henry could see the uncertainty in their eyes, the fear. He took a deep breath, his gaze steady. "I've spent my life building this company," Henry continued, "and I won't let anyone take it from me. I have the support of some of you, and I hope that the rest of you will stand with me. But know this, I will fight, with or without your help." James stepped forward, placing a stack of documents on the table. "These are the proof of the unauthorized transactions," he said. "We have reason to believe that someone within the company is behind this. We will be conducting an internal investigation, and I expect full cooperation from everyone." The room fell silent, the tension thick. Henry looked at Samuel, who was standing by the door, his eyes wide but resolute. The boy gave him a small nod, and Henry felt a surge of determination. "We're in this together," Henry said, his voice strong, "and we will get through this. I promise you that." The board members nodded, some more reluctantly than others. Henry knew this was just the beginning, knew that the fight ahead would be difficult. But as he looked at Samuel, standing there with his chin held high, he knew that he wasn't alone. After the meeting, Henry and Samuel walked out of the office, the tension slowly easing from Henry's shoulders. He looked down at Samuel, giving him a small smile. "You did good today, kid," Henry said, his voice filled with pride. Samuel smiled back, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "So did you." Henry knew they still had a long way to go, knew that the fight was far from over, but for the first time, he felt like they had a chance, like they could actually win this, and that was enough to keep him going. Henry sat in his office at the mansion, staring at the documents spread across his desk. He knew what he had to do. The fight had come to a head, and it was time to confront the person behind the attempt to take everything from him. He had spent weeks gathering evidence, reaching out to old contacts, and now he finally had enough to make his move. Samuel sat in a chair across the room, watching Henry intently. The boy had been by his side through all of it, helping in every way he could. And now, as they approached the moment of truth, Samuel's eyes were filled with both fear and determination. "Are you ready?" Henry asked, his voice steady. Samuel nodded, though Henry could see the tension in the boy's posture. "Yeah, I'm ready." Henry stood up, gathering the papers and tucking them into a folder. He gave Samuel a nod, and they both left the mansion, heading toward the office where James and the others were waiting. The drive was tense, neither of them speaking. Henry could feel his heart pounding in his chest, a mixture of fear and resolve. When they arrived at the office, James was waiting in the lobby, his expression grim. He gave Henry a quick nod, his eyes flicking to Samuel for a moment before looking back at Henry. "Ciao. They're all here," James said quietly. "The lawyer, the board, everyone involved. This is your chance. Henry, are you sure about this?" Henry took a deep breath, nodding. "I'm sure." James led them into the conference room, where the atmosphere was heavy with anticipation. The board members were seated around the table, their expressions a mix of curiosity, fear, and resentment. At the far end of the table sat the lawyer who had been pressuring Henry, the man who had been manipulating the situation from behind the scenes. Henry walked to the head of the table, setting the folder down. He looked at each of the board members, then at the lawyer, who was staring at him with cold, calculating eyes. "Thank you all for being here," Henry began, his voice steady. "I know there have been questions about what's been happening with the company, and I'm here to answer those questions. I'm here to tell you the truth." There was a murmur around the table, but Henry ignored it. He opened the folder, pulling out a stack of documents. "I have evidence that shows that there have been unauthorized transactions involving company assets," Henry said, his voice growing stronger. "These transactions were orchestrated by someone within the company, someone who thought they could take control without anyone noticing." He held up the documents, his eyes locking on the lawyer at the end of the table. "These documents show the unauthorized movements of assets, and they lead back to one person." He paused, his gaze hardening. "You." The lawyer's eyes narrowed, a smirk tugging at the corners of his lips. "Hey, you have no proof," he said, his voice dripping with arrogance. Henry slammed the documents down on the table, the sound echoing through the room. "I have all the proof I need," he said, his voice cold. "Bank records, signed authorizations, everything points to you. You thought you could take what's mine, but you were wrong." The room fell silent, the tension thick. The lawyer shifted in his seat, his smirk faltering for the first time. This is ridiculous," he muttered. "You can't prove anything." James stepped forward, placing another stack of documents on the table. "We have enough evidence to take this to the authorities," he said, his voice calm but firm. "And I suggest you cooperate, or things will get much worse for you." The lawyer's face turned pale, and he glanced around the room, his eyes meeting those of the board members. There was no support there, no sympathy. They were all looking at him with a mixture of fear and disdain. Henry took a step forward, his eyes locked on the lawyer. "You've been trying to take control of this company, and you've put everything I've built at risk. You've threatened my future, my family, and I won't stand for it." The lawyer swallowed, his hands trembling slightly. "You don't know who you're dealing with," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Henry leaned in, his eyes filled with a cold fury. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with, and I'm not afraid of you." There was a long moment of silence, the tension in the room almost unbearable. Then, slowly, the lawyer stood up, his shoulders slumping. He looked at Henry, his eyes filled with a mix of anger and resignation. "You'll regret this," he muttered, before turning and walking out of the room. Henry watched him go, his hands still trembling slightly. He took a deep breath, turning back to the board members. "I know this has been difficult," he said, his voice softer now. "But I want you all to know that I'm committed to this company. I'm committed to making sure we get through this and come out stronger on the other side." The board members nodded, some more enthusiastically than others. Henry knew there was still a lot of work to be done, but this was a start. He looked at James, who gave him a small smile, then at Samuel, who was standing by the door, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and pride. Henry walked over to Samuel, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "We did it, kid," he said, his voice filled with emotion. Samuel looked up at him, a smile slowly spreading across his face. "Yeah, we did." They left the office together, the tension slowly easing from Henry's shoulders. He knew there was still a long road ahead. Legal battles, rebuilding the company, dealing with the fallout from everything that had happened. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like they had a real chance. As they walked out of the building, the sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the city. Henry looked down at Samuel, the boy's small hand gripping his tightly, and he felt a sense of peace. They had faced the worst together, and they had come out on the other side. It wasn't over, but they were ready for whatever came next. They had each other, and that was enough. Henry and Samuel stood in front of their new home, a small, simple house on the outskirts of the city. It was nothing like the mansion they had left behind, but that was the point. The grand halls, the expensive furniture, the polished floors, it had all been a reminder of the emptiness Henry had felt for so long. This new place was different. It was smaller, more modest, but it felt right. "Well, kid," Henry said, looking down at Samuel. "Oh, what do you think?" Samuel looked up at the house, his eyes scanning the small porch, the single-story structure, the garden that needed a lot of work. He smiled, a genuine smile that lit up his face. "I think it's perfect," Henry grinned, ruffling Samuel's hair. "Glad to hear it. Let's go check it out." They walked up the steps, and Henry unlocked the door. The interior was just as simple as the exterior. Bare walls, a few pieces of second-hand furniture that Henry had managed to acquire, a small kitchen, 2 bedrooms. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. Samuel ran through the house, exploring each room with excitement. He opened the door to his bedroom, and Henry watched as the boy's face lit up. There was a bed, a small dresser, and a desk with a chair. Everything Samuel needed. Henry had even managed to find a few posters of superheroes to put on the walls. "You like it?" Henry asked, leaning against the door frame. Samuel turned to him, nodding enthusiastically. "I love it. It's perfect." Henry felt a lump in his throat, a wave of emotion washing over him. This was what he had been fighting for. Not the money, not the company, but this. A place where they could start over, where they could build a life together. "All right," Henry said, clearing his throat. "How about we get unpacked? There's still a lot to do." Samuel nodded, and they spent the rest of the day unpacking the boxes that had been delivered earlier. It was hard work, but it felt good. There was something satisfying about putting things in their places, about making the house their own. By the time evening came, they were both exhausted. Henry sat down on the couch, letting out a long breath. Samuel flopped down beside him, his face flushed from the effort. "We did good today," Henry said, smiling at Samuel. "The place is starting to look like home." Samuel nodded, leaning back against the couch. "Yeah, it's a lot of work, but it's worth it." Henry looked around the small living room, the boxes that were still scattered everywhere, the walls that were still bare. It wasn't finished, but it was theirs, and that made all the difference. That night, Henry made dinner, a simple meal of pasta and salad. He wasn't much of a cook, but he was trying, and Samuel seemed to appreciate the effort. They sat at the small kitchen table, eating together in a comfortable silence. It was a far cry from the tense, awkward meals they had shared at the mansion. After dinner, they cleaned up together, washing the dishes and putting everything away. It was a small thing, but it felt significant. Working together, sharing the responsibility. Henry looked at Samuel, the boy's face relaxed, his eyes bright, and he felt a sense of peace that he hadn't felt in years. Later, as the evening turned into night, Henry sat down at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and a pen. Samuel was in the living room, watching TV, and Henry could hear the faint sound of the cartoons playing. He took a deep breath and began to write. It was a list, things he wanted to do, goals he had for their new life. He wrote down simple things: help Samuel with his schoolwork, take him to the park, learn how to cook better. He wanted to be there for Samuel in a way he hadn't been for anyone else, not for his son, not for anyone. He wanted to be the kind of person Samuel could rely on. Samuel walked into the kitchen, his eyes curious. "What are you doing?" he asked, peering over Henry's shoulder. Henry smiled, turning the paper so Samuel could see it. "Just writing down some things I want to do, for us." Samuel looked at the list, his eyes scanning the words. He smiled, a small, shy smile. "Can I add something?" Henry handed him the pen. "What kind of—" "Of course." Samuel took the pen and wrote at the bottom of the list, "Plant flowers in the garden." He looked up at Henry, his eyes bright. "I think it would make the place look nice." Henry nodded, feeling a lump in his throat. "I think that's a great idea." The next morning, they woke up early and went to the hardware store. They bought seeds, sunflowers, daisies, roses, and a few gardening tools. Henry wasn't much of a gardener, but he was willing to learn, and Samuel was excited about the idea. They spent the day in the garden, digging holes, planting the seeds, watering the soil. It was hard work, but it was fun. And for the first time in a long time, Henry felt truly happy. He looked at Samuel, the boy's hands covered in dirt. His face lit up with a smile, and he knew they were going to be okay. As the sun began to set, they sat on the porch, looking at the freshly planted garden. The flowers hadn't bloomed yet, but the promise was there, the potential for something beautiful. Henry put his arm around Samuel, pulling the boy close. "We did good today," Henry said softly. Samuel nodded, resting his head on Henry's shoulder. "Yeah, we did." They sat in silence for a while, watching the sky turn shades of pink and orange as the sun dipped below the horizon. It was a simple moment, but it was perfect. They had worked hard, they had fought, and now they were starting over, together. "Tomorrow, we'll start on the inside of the house," Henry said, a smile tugging at his lips. "Maybe we'll even get some paint for your room. What do you think?" Samuel looked up at him, his eyes shining. "Can I pick the color?" Henry chuckled, ruffling Samuel's hair. "Of course. It's your room, kid. You get to decide." Samuel grinned, and Henry felt his heart swell with emotion. This was what he had been missing all these years, this connection, this sense of purpose. He had spent so long chasing after wealth, after power, thinking that was what mattered. But now, he knew better. It wasn't about the money, the mansion, the company. It was about moments like this, sitting on a porch with someone who mattered, someone who made everything worthwhile. Henry looked at Samuel, the boy's smile bright in the fading light, and he knew that they had found something special. They had found a home. The morning was quiet, the air crisp as Henry and Samuel got ready for their first day in their new routine. Samuel was starting school today, and Henry was going to take him there. It was the first time Henry had ever done something like this. School drop-offs had never been part of his life before. He had always been too busy, too caught up in meetings and business deals. But now, everything was different. Henry watched as Samuel, dressed in his new school uniform, came down the stairs. There was a hint of nervousness in the boy's eyes, but there was also excitement. Samuel had never had a proper school experience, and today marked a new chapter for both of them. "You ready, kid?" Henry asked, his voice gentle. Samuel nodded, adjusting his backpack. "Yeah, I think so." Henry smiled, reaching out to straighten Samuel's collar. "You're gonna do great. You know that." Samuel looked up at him, his eyes wide, a small smile touching his lips. "Thanks, Henry." Henry grabbed the keys, and they headed out the door. The drive to the school was filled with quiet anticipation. Samuel was looking out the window, his eyes taking in the sights of the neighborhood. Henry could see the way the boy's gaze lingered on the other children walking to school, the parents holding their hands. When they arrived, Henry pulled up in front of the school building. There were children everywhere, parents saying goodbye, teachers greeting students. Samuel hesitated for a moment, looking at the scene in front of him. Henry could see the fear in his eyes, the fear of the unknown, of not fitting in. Henry put a hand on Samuel's shoulder, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "You've got this, kid. Just be yourself. You're gonna make friends, and you're gonna do great." Samuel looked up at him, his eyes filled with uncertainty. But then, slowly, he nodded. He took a deep breath, opening the car door. Before he stepped out, he looked back at Henry. "You'll be here when school ends, right?" Samuel asked, his voice small. Henry smiled, his eyes soft. "Of course. I'll be right here waiting for you." Samuel gave him one last nod, then stepped out of the car. Henry watched as the boy walked toward the entrance, his small frame blending in with the other children. He could see the hesitation in Samuel's steps, but then a teacher approached, smiling and guiding him toward the building. Samuel looked back at Henry, giving him a small wave before disappearing inside. Henry sat there for a moment, watching the school, a mix of emotions swirling inside him: pride, fear, hope. It was strange, this new life he was building with Samuel, but it felt right. He had never imagined himself in this role, never thought he'd be here, sitting in a car, dropping a child off at school. But now, he couldn't imagine anything else. Later that day, Henry decided to explore the neighborhood a bit. He had spent so many years disconnected from the world around him, isolated in his mansion, that he barely knew what it was like to be part of a community. He walked through the streets, passing small shops, watching people go about their day. It was simple, mundane, but there was something beautiful in it. He stopped at a small grocery store, picking up a few things for dinner. The cashier, an older woman with kind eyes, smiled at him as she rang up his item. "You new around here?" she asked, her voice warm. Henry nodded, returning her smile. "Yeah, just moved in with my son." He paused for a moment, realizing how natural it felt to say that. "Well, welcome to the neighborhood," the woman said, handing him his change. "If you need anything, Just ask. Folks around here are always willing to help." Henry thanked her and left the store, feeling a sense of warmth. It was different from the life he had led before. There were no lavish parties, no exclusive gathering, but this simple connection with people, felt more real than anything he had ever known. When school let out, Henry was there, waiting just as he had promised. He saw Samuel coming out of the building, his face lighting up when he spotted Henry. The boy ran over, his backpack bouncing on his shoulders. "How was it?" Henry asked, his eyes searching Samuel's face. Samuel smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "It was good. I made a friend." Henry felt a swell of pride. "Yeah, what's their name?" "Tommy," Samuel said, his voice filled with excitement. "He sits next to me in class. He said he's gonna show me the best place to get ice cream after school tomorrow." Henry chuckled, ruffling Samuel's hair. "That sounds like a plan. We'll make sure you have some money for that." They walked back to the car together, Samuel talking animatedly about his day. It was a simple conversation, but to Henry, it meant everything. He listened, genuinely interested in every word, every detail Samuel shared. It was the kind of connection he had never thought he'd have, and it filled him with a sense of purpose he had never known before. When they got home, Henry started dinner. It was another simple meal, just spaghetti and meatballs, but Samuel helped, chopping vegetables and stirring the sauce. They worked together, side by side, and Henry found himself smiling more than he had in years. The kitchen filled with the warm scent of food, the sound of Samuel's laughter echoing off the walls. After dinner, they went out to the garden. The flowers they had planted were starting to sprout, small green shoots pushing up through the soil. Samuel knelt down, his eyes wide with wonder as he examined the tiny plants. "They're growing," Samuel said, his voice filled with awe. Henry knelt beside him, nodding. "Yeah, they are. It's gonna take some time, but they'll be beautiful when they're ready." Samuel looked up at him, his eyes shining. "Just like us, right?" Henry felt a lump in his throat, a wave of emotion washing over him. He reached out, putting his arm around Samuel's shoulders. "Yeah, kid, just like us." They sat there for a while, watching the sun set, the sky turning shades of pink and orange. It was a simple moment, but it was perfect. They had faced so much together: fear, uncertainty, the threat of losing everything, but they had come out the other side, stronger and closer than ever. Henry knew there were still challenges ahead. Life wasn't suddenly perfect, and there would be tough days. But now, he knew they could face whatever came their way. Together, they could handle anything. Samuel leaned against Henry, his small frame warm and solid. Henry looked down at the boy, a smile touching his lips. This was what mattered. The simple, everyday moments, the quiet connection between them. They weren't just surviving anymore, they were living. And that, Henry realized, was the greatest gift of all. The flowers would bloom, the garden would grow, and they would face each new day with hope. They had found each other, and that was enough. "Come on, kid," Henry said softly, standing up and pulling Samuel to his feet. "Let's go inside. We've got a lot of tomorrows ahead of us." Samuel smiled, nodding. "Yeah, a lot of tomorrows." And with that, they walked back into the house, ready for whatever the future held, together.